Okay, perfect. All right, cool, guys. So we're good to go. Online, streaming, everything. First off, I just wanted to thank Phil for inviting me out here, allowing me to speak to all of you in the Dallas community. It's a pretty large community, it seems, and it was very interesting driving up here. I've been through Dallas a couple times, but that was when I lived in Nebraska. I'd come down to Houston, visit family, and then I'd get stuck in Dallas for over an hour just because of traffic. So I was like, that's not going to be an issue today. So on the way from my hotel, 20 minutes from here, basically. Yeah, it took about almost an hour to get here. So thanks for that, guys. But yeah, Dallas is cool. I've been here several times. It's obviously the first time at Pone School, and very thankful to be here. And like Phil said, we met back probably before August of last year, and I've just kind of bounced some questions off of him via like career stuff and ideas, and he's been very receptive and helpful. So, like I said, appreciate being here. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So today I'm going to be presenting about red team tactics for pen testers. I may not dive too deep into the tool sets just because those are easy to find online. What we're going to talk about is kind of the methodology, really getting into that mindset, how it can be beneficial for a pen tester. So my name is Samuel Kimmons, as Phil mentioned already. A quick side note though, the default slide that everyone has to throw up there. All thoughts and opinions are expressed by me during this presentation are my own and do not represent those of my employer. And that is 100% true because the Air Force is allowing me to come up here and talk. So anything I say has nothing to do with the Air Force. I may bring stories out from the time down there, but not associated, okay? Okay, so what are we going to cover? Our roadmap for the evening is basically we're going to, who am I? Why am I talking to you about red team tactics for pen testers? We're going to kind of define what's red teaming versus pen testing and what's the difference really. Why red team tactics should be important to pen testers. I'm probably going to spend a lot of time on that just because I'm very passionate about that. So the risk of adversarial activities, and that goes for both in your environment. So obviously if there's an adversary or an APT in your environment, you're probably already screwed. But this is more along the lines of utilizing known adversarial techniques from a pen testing or a red teaming standpoint on your environment, what kind of risk that poses to said environment. And of course, getting into the mindset of a threat actor, how do we do that? What do we use to get ourselves to that kind of planning cycle, et cetera? And of course, I kind of mentioned that already. How can a red team mindset change the typical pen testing process? We'll dive into that a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll compare the red team methodology up against the traditional pen test methodology and kind of figure out where they differ and how one can improve the other. We'll cover the different types of red team engagements. There's tons, obviously, tons of different types, but I only go into two just because I have experience with those two. I'll give you an example, kind of an operational flow of what the execution phase kind of looks like, the planning, the development, and kind of what my team does. We use a lot of DevOps methodology in our planning and execution phases. So it gets pretty interesting. And then of course, finding similarities in adversary TTPs, which are tactics, techniques, and procedures, if you're not familiar, and pen testing actions. So correlating your pen testing actions with known adversarial techniques or tactics. And of course, the keys to effective engagements, kind of my recipe for the keys to success when utilizing red team tactics on a network or in an organization. So that's actually going to be really fun. So, all right, so who am I? Why am I speaking to you about red team tactics? Well, I'm a red teamer, of course, so that's why I'm speaking about it. But I specialize in adversary emulation, basically getting the intel from either the threat intelligence cell or finding open source or closed source pieces of information and tearing apart those TTPs and finding out how we can utilize them on our environment. And basically, I like to throw in some purple teaming, if you're familiar with the concept, where we work hand in hand with blue team, because I believe obviously the goal of red team is to make blue better, and we probably all agree on that because like that's our main job. Obviously, I've seen people post something on Twitter saying like, your job is to basically drive yourself out of a job because you want the network to be so secure that you don't need to be there to defend it almost, or even to test it. So my red team background actually spawns kind of far back, but is more evolved over the past year. I stood up the internal red team at the U.S. APTs. If you're not familiar with that, that's the United States Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team. We focus on enterprise incident response, threat hunting, basically across a massive enterprise of several 100,000 endpoints, and obviously geographically dispersed functions. I have a few certs. I'm not going to throw them all up there, but these are my favorite three that I think have helped me a lot in my career. GXPen, probably one of the toughest tests I've ever taken. GPen, very interesting if you're not familiar with the hacker methodology or pentesting methodology. Really harps on reporting a lot, and that's key during pen testing, conveying your results to those who make the decisions. And GWAP's probably my favorite, I think. Not the hardest one I've taken, but if I could pen test web apps all day long, I would, just because it's like solving a puzzle, really, getting into the mindset of the developer who created the code. That's always fun. But so my path, how I led to become a red teamer. So I started out as a system administrator working on, Server 2008, Active Directory structures, doing all that fun stuff, deploying systems across the enterprise. Moved into a SOC analyst role for about a year, where I conducted obviously like entry-level investigations before it got passed off to a more seasoned incident response operator. And from there, I actually got lucky and moved into the pen testing shop. And so just some backstory, the Air Force does have a red team and they're freaking amazing, but they don't get to focus on my specific organization a lot. And so as a pen tester, I would find that I'm finding all these bad things. How do I convey the severity to my boss or my leadership, really, to get these things fixed? Turns out if you tie potential vulnerabilities with known adversarial TTPs, as in like, hey, this adversary likes to target X, Y, and Z, you should probably fix this. All of a sudden, heads got caught on fire, basically, because they're running around scrambling, trying to fix things. Even benign things, really. But low-hanging fruit is a way in. And then that led me to stand up the internal red team. Basically, that event spawned the past year of my life of building a team of kind of specialized operators, as I'll call them. So most of them focus on pen testing. I got a couple of forensic analysts to help us really dive in to find out what our actions are doing on the network and how we can actually build a playbook or some type of defensive measure to effectively stop this type of activity on the network. I have a YouTube channel, not as active as I should be on there. I got a couple videos that focus on cert reviews and a couple living off the land technique videos. I like to hack things just because I thought it was cheesy and funny. Yeah, so if you want to follow me on Twitter or just shoot me a message anytime, Valken_K, an old pseudonym from back in my gaming days. But yeah, I don't post any crazy stuff on there, so we're good. Safe for work. All right, so we'll start off with defining what a red team is, or what red teaming is, and I'm going to be very precise on here because I don't want to mess up FireEye's definition. I chose FireEye's definition because I kind of liked how it was very general in nature, but it actually explained it to those who don't really understand red teaming. So red team assessments focus on giving your security team practical experience combating real cyber attacks while avoiding business damaging tactics. These assessments use conventional and advanced attacker TTP, so tactics, techniques, and procedures, to targeted agreed upon objectives. And another little portion from another paragraph is red team operations test your internal security staff's ability to safeguard critical assets. And that's key, of course. Like when we're red teaming, we're not just testing the defenses, right? Because like I can get a pen test to come in and find all the vulnerabilities, pop a shell. Okay, we got domain admin. Good job, guys. Now, what did we really learn from that? And that's where you come in with a red team, purple team mindset of testing the blue teamer. How do we improve the blue teamer themselves, the person on the keyboard defending the network day in and day out, or investigating those potential malicious events? And so that's why I kind of latched on to this specific definition, because it really hit home with me, because the whole reason I developed that section, or that work center as the internal red team at the AppCert, is because I believe in testing and validating our defensive measures and the operators who employ them. So, and then we have the counter side of what is a penetration test. I took this one from Wikipedia because, let's be honest, there's like 1,000 definitions of what a penetration test is, and all of them could be correct to some extent, but Wikipedia, generalized knowledge. So a penetration test is an authorized simulated cyber attack on a computer system performed to evaluate the security of the system The test is performed to identify both weaknesses, vulnerabilities, including the potential for unauthorized parties to gain access to the system's features and data, as well as strengths, enabling a full risk assessment to be completed. And like I said, that comes from Wikipedia, and I think that really hits home with most pen testing in a general sense, really, because you're there to find the vulnerabilities, find a way in, get domain admin or whatever your end goal is, and okay, here's your risk to the organization. What do these vulnerabilities pose based on a scoring system? And like I said, it usually has a specific goal. As with red teaming, you typically have a specific goal. You're probably going after a specific target that you've spent months planning and executing just to reach that one target, as opposed to back in my pen testing days, literally just getting in. Okay, cool, we're done. So as with red teaming, there's multiple types, and of course with pen testing, there's multiple types. So there's a lot of the industry is focused on web apps right now because obviously there's money in it. But from an internal standpoint, pen testing your web apps is key because while it may be something that HR uses internally, it may also be public facing, and so that's an open vulnerability. And we'll talk more about a web app during a red team engagement. Of course, there's network pen testing and there's application security. We can go down the line because there's so many different types. And this should go without saying, but red teaming is not fancy pen testing. It is not. They are two drastically different things, but they sometimes employ the same tactics. For instance, like you may use Metasploit to throw an exploit. On the red team, maybe I'll do that, but using something pre-generated might burn my access. So would I want to just throw some script kiddie stuff on there? Probably not. But as a pen tester, I just want to get in. I just want to find the hole and get in, right? So definitions are pretty similar, but vastly different in practice. So the question is, why should you care about red team tactics? Whether you're a pen tester, blue teamer, manager, et cetera. We'll get into the blue team side at the end because I don't want to leave them out. It's a simple equation, really. They can improve your skill set by researching adversarial TTP, so tactics, techniques, and procedures. You really dive into what some of the most advanced threat actors are actually doing. And you may find that they're actually not doing really advanced things. They're just taking advantage of what's already there. So living off the land techniques. We'll get more into that later, but that's probably one of my favorite things to tell people is like, okay, why do we need a red team? Okay, but why should I become a red teamer, basically? And they keep you aware of current trends. Like if you follow threat feeds, or FireEye, for instance, produces some great white papers, and then from there you could spawn off several different links to DEF CON Black Hat papers, et cetera, where you can really dive deep into the trends that are happening out there in the wild. And unless your organization is a target of that, or at least unless you're monitoring for that type of attack or those types of attacks, you're probably not going to see this type of activity anywhere else besides on these white papers or reports. And this is key for pen testers. They can bring an enormous amount of value to your activities. Okay, I'm gonna spell that. Don't screenshot that. Okay. Anyways, so yeah, so we'll talk more about correlating your pen testing actions with adversary TTPs, because like I mentioned before, I was able to really drive home the severity of a vulnerability based on the correlated data between APT X and this vulnerability, because it was their easy button, easy go. And of course, they're really fun. Like if you enjoy any type of pen testing, you're probably going to enjoy red teaming, minus the planning portion, because I don't know if any of you have done red teaming before, but you could literally spend months planning an engagement that may last 1 day or 2 weeks or 6 weeks. It's like, that's probably the only downside I could see. But when you jump into the red team side, you get to play with potential adversary malware, depending on if you have a function at your organization that allows you to RE some known malicious payloads that you may see come across the wire. And then if you can, you get to reuse those on your own engagements. And that's always fun because people freak out. So what are the risks of adversarial activities? And of course, this is kind of like a two-pronged question. It's like, what are the risks of adversarial activities on my network or my environments? Like that kind of goes along with a pen test, almost kind of a risk assessment. Like, where do we see the vulnerabilities and are they susceptible to adversarial activity? If you haven't thought about that, it's probably time to start thinking about that, especially depending on your industry, finance, et cetera, government. And this is always the scary button for managers. At least I found when building my team was, oh, you want to use adversarial activity, like adversary TTPs on my network? Are you kidding me? I'm like, whoa, hold on. We pen test the network weekly or daily sometimes. They didn't see the correlation that some of the tactics are the same. And so obviously conveying to them, these are literally the same thing I've been doing, the same things we've been doing, except for we're going to present them in a different light and show how they correlate to malicious activity. And obviously, if there's an adversary or advanced threat actor on your network and you don't know it, that's a whole nother story. So getting into the mindset of a threat actor, what methods can you use to get into the mindset of an adversary? So I kind of mentioned threat intel earlier, but that's a key ingredient to a successful red team engagement. And even from a pen test standpoint, like for instance, if you're going on a pen test, you know, you're gonna do your recon, your scanning, and you're gonna find your way in. Okay, cool. Doesn't mean you're thinking maliciously about it, right? And I kind of take a quote from, I think Ryan over at who used to run the red team at Target would put on his application. Have you ever planned a break-in while standing in line? I mean, that's the adversary mindset right there. If you find yourself thinking that way, you probably have a good inclination that you should be on a red team or doing this type of activity. Because I'm pretty sure all of us have probably thought something like that along the lines or at one point in our life. And of course, it's obviously you're not always going to be thinking maliciously. It's kind of like a switch, right? And it's like you know when to apply that thinking process. And how does the engagement process differ from a traditional pen test? So we'll get more into that because there's obviously some similarities and there's a lot of differences when it comes to pen testing versus a typical red team engagement. So I wanted to cover a couple of the typical pen testing methodologies as far as the typical process and where kind of throw in a kind of a red team spin to them. So during pen testing, like for instance, I did one, it was just over a year ago before I set up the red team. And I probably spent 3 days on recon, just doing open source research on trying to find my way in. And then obviously once you narrow down your target on a pen test, I'm not too worried about them noticing me really. So the scanning portion didn't take as long once I found, depends, right? Yeah, depends. So it didn't take as long as the recon portion because I narrowed down my targets, right? But so for red teaming, these probably take almost as long as the planning portion because you have to be, unless like blue team knows you're coming, it's like an open engagement, like, hey, we're doing this on this date. The recon portion and scanning literally take forever. Like if you're planning for a month, this could take up to 2 weeks to do scanning because you don't want to notify them that you're doing this type of activity. As simple as like ping requests, you know what I mean? It's like we don't want any resemblance of, oh, there's something coming, we need to look out for this, red team's going to be doing actions on the network. No, that's probably the key difference, is being quiet and being stealthy and picking your targets and being very selective in your actions. The enumeration and vulnerability identification. So from like a pen test process, basically it's pretty straightforward. You do your scanning, your vulnerability assessments. Maybe you find some vulnerabilities that aren't showing up on, like, say, your Nessus report or something, and then use those to get in. And they may be accurate, they may be not. So at least some of the pen tests I've done, we've done both external and internal recon. So once we have access, it could be like low level, low privileged access, and we'll do some type of enumeration or vulnerability identification. And if you've done that, even as a blue teamer, you've noticed probably that if you don't have like a credential, like a high level credential to access, some of those reports are actually not going to come back 100% accurate. And you may see that obviously on the outside too, coming externally because of WAFs, et cetera. Or you just don't have a presence facing externally, and you have to obviously use phishing to get in. But so for the red teaming side, this is obviously one of the most difficult portions, at least for me, because you may get a defined scope kind of during a pen test. You would get a defined scope or kind of your rules of engagement almost. But for the red teaming portion, this is the difficult part. We'll get more into like the various types of red teaming. But if if you're emulating a specific adversary and you know that they like to target a specific vulnerability, even if you find like, if you're on the inside and you find eternal blue sitting everywhere, it doesn't mean you should pop it, right? Because we're trying to be quiet and we're trying to be selective. So like I said, it may be really time consuming. And then we move into the exploitation, post-exploitation, and reporting phases. Exploitation on the pen testing side, honestly, does it have to be calculated? No, not really, depending on the scope and the rules defined during the planning or the agreement phase. We're basically just going to try to get in, as I've mentioned before. I want domain admin. That's my end goal. I don't care about the data on the network, etc. But for the red team portion, the exploitation is probably the most dangerous portion, because if you burn an exploit, it doesn't work, you may have just burned your access. And if you don't have redundant access, you're screwed. Like, your whole operation is done. 3 months of planning down the drain because you burned an exploit because you were trying to pull a pen testing action and just throw eternal blue or throw some web-facing vulnerability exploit. Obviously, we don't want to throw eternal blue at everything because there's a limited success rate. The post-exploitation phase. So on a pen testing side, like for me personally, when after I'd get access, and let's say it's elevated access, I'm just trying to get to the end goal, right? As fast as possible. Find the vulnerabilities, find some weaknesses, get to the endpoint. Whether that be I want to get on the domain controller or the file share or the email server. That's about it. As far as like when you think about it from a red team perspective, this is probably where the real juice or the real meat of your engagement is, because you most likely have a specific target, a specific objective. Like, you want to data exfil things from the CEO's desktop, right? And during a pen test, it's probably off limits, right? Like, we're not going to go and throw eternal blue or something at the CEO's desktop, unless, of course, that's in our scope and one of our objectives. But for the red teaming, like, our goal may be to find financial data, and let's get it out. Let's DNS exfil. Let's do something along those lines. And then we move into the reporting phase. And this is where you convey the severity of the results. Like, on a normal pen test report, you're going to say along the lines of like, your recommendation for remediation, here's all the highs and mediums and lows we found. We recommend, you patch in this order. But for the red teaming portion, like, if you think about it from a red team side, you want to convey the severity, as in I used the example earlier of APTX uses this specific exploit or this specific tactic. Like, if they're using a specific tactic to move laterally throughout your network, or their networks they've compromised, and you were able to do that as a pen tester, and you can highlight, sure, maybe don't phrase it as like, oh, I used the technique from APTX, because that might get some people pissed off. But if you're able to say, like, we suggest you don't allow internal hosts to communicate via SMB. Like, why do they need to talk to each other? It's just an open point to move laterally. And they're like, okay, whatever. But if you say, oh, APT 28, for example, they love to use SMB to hop around your network to get to what I think it's APT 28. They have an 18-minute exploitation time. Once they're in, they own the network in 18 minutes. How do you do that if no hosts are able to talk, really? So if you can convey that severity, really, that APTX uses this tactic, it might actually sell your report a little more effectively. And we talked about already conveying the severity of the client. So, all right, I use this example. I know I got ahead of myself, but that part really interests me, because it's how you sell your product, really. And I'm not talking from a third party or a vendor standpoint, but it's how you sell your work and show that it's actually viable information. And honestly, like, the people who I report to, they would probably be a little scared if they found out that an APT was using this exact same technique that we just used to move around the entire enterprise. So what kind of tactics should you use as a pen tester when you're trying to think or more act in a more of a mindset of a red team or adversary? So living off the land techniques are a big deal right now. This is probably one of my favorite topics. Like, I live in PowerShell because it's on almost every enterprise that uses Windows. Like, if it's a modern Windows 10, we're probably gonna have PowerShell 4 at least. And from that, you can conduct your entire operation. Why even drop a binary or something, even fileless malware? Why even do that? If I have a fully patched Windows 10 box, up to date with PowerShell, I'm good to go. Like, I own your network. Like, I can move around and do anything I want via just PowerShell. And even if we were stuck with, like, just regular batch commands or CMD commands, that's still decent, because then we can use WMI to move around. And who's tracking WMI unless you got like CrowdStrike as your EDR solution, right? But who can afford that? And so like when you're thinking about it from a pen testing perspective, like I could create an exe or a file, PHP something with MS Venom, and then throw it over to the endpoint, execute it, and connect via alternate ports and move laterally that way. But why do that? Why give your process away? Why give your location away and drop a binary on the system if there's no reason to? And so I kind of mentioned earlier with the red teaming, like you may only have one shot. You don't want to burn your access because you decided to use MSF Venom or some IOC based or some exe that already has an IOC in most detection systems, right? We don't want to burn our access. And so the adversaries, they're using what's available on the compromised networks. If you to look at the MITRE attack matrix and you were to go down each column and then click on an APT, you see that they're just using generic commands. They're not, besides obviously custom-based malware to do C2, but that's a whole nother story. We can do C2 with PowerShell if we really wanted to. Yeah, so they're not just gonna drop stuff on the network. So why should you really? Why should you as a pen tester give your position away? I know that most of the time pen testing you already seeded access and everything, but it can really help you drive that severity, like we mentioned. Like, oh, why are we allowing just regular users to use PowerShell to download files? That shouldn't be a thing, but we take advantage of it because it's there. And the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's probably my favorite thing. I don't put that in reports because obviously that's unprofessional, but I'll say it during the meeting because they're like, oh, we didn't detect you doing X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, I mean, why would I do something different? It works and you can't find it. And obviously, why reinvent the wheel? Because the adversaries definitely aren't reinventing the wheel. They're using what's there. All right, so the planning process. Planning is often the most important and time-consuming part of red teaming. And if you've worked with a red team or some type of red team engagement, you probably know that this is a very tedious process. Obviously, it can be entertaining depending on what parties are involved, but this is like your bread and butter, really. If your plan isn't sound, your operation or your execution is going to be horrible and it's going to fail, or it's going to succeed, but maybe you had to make some deviations. And sometimes deviations can be kind of an issue depending on the organization you work for. So like on the Air Force side, deviations are allowed to an extent, right? Because while I kind of have a free reign, my scope is still defined. Like I have to stay in my lane and I can't just deviate way outside that. Like I can't go hit, we'll say HR's network because like not allowed to go there or something. Or if it's in game, I may not be able to touch, maybe they'll touch the manager's computer, etc. But if that's the only box I have, I may be allowed to deviate and stay on that box. Okay, so the first part here is kind of like a brainstorm methodology, but then the bottom part is the exact methodology that my team uses. So we have plan, we research, we plan some more, we decide on a plan. Once all teams are involved and say, okay, which this is probably the longest process, we research some more, we develop whatever we're going to use, we execute. Like I said, could take a day, could take months, and then we're going to debrief all parties involved. But more logically thinking and more organized, we use the plan, develop, execute, debrief state process. So like the military uses what's called PBED, if you're familiar with it, plan, brief, execute, debrief. It's a lengthy process, and it doesn't really work for most enterprise-based teams or industry teams. And so that's why I kind of came up with the plan, develop, execute, just to like kind of solidify the wording to it. So we'll go through the typical planning process where we'll decide on the scope, we'll decide on the target, we'll decide on the mission, the objective, etc. And then so in the development phase, this is kind of, it ties in both the actual development of where you're writing code, but it ties in the entire team. So if everybody's collectively developing, there's no reason to continuously brief because we're all working together. And that's probably one of the key things that I kind of don't see on some pen testing teams is like, is a lot of people, I don't want to say like just go cowboy in the network, but sometimes they do, and they don't like inform their teammates. I know that's probably like a sign of an unprofessional team, but I have seen it in the wild, like as an industry when I've gone and worked with a couple pretty big names. But yeah, so the development portion is extremely important, and then we do go through an execute cycle where we complete our objective, hopefully, depending on the time frame, and then we'll debrief all parties involved. So let's talk about the two different types. So we're going to kind of move a little bit further into the red side now. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the two types of red teaming that I have experience with and what I've implemented at my own organization. So we have selected adversary emulation versus imaginary adversary. And of course, there's a purpose to both of these. There's a reason to use both these types in your environment. So selected adversary emulation helps correlate known threats with the security posture of your org. Kind of we mentioned testing the operators or testing the defenders. This is where this type of emulation comes into play. Really, it really tests your defenses. Like, can you detect this? Can you respond to this? Can you mitigate this? And it's very focused. Then we move over to the imaginary adversary. So full scope, creation of adversary, new adversary using either homebrew TTPs or selected from known adversaries. So we'll get into that a little bit more. So what are the benefits of adversary emulation? So we're focusing on a specific adversary, let's say APT 28, and we want to use those exact techniques for an exact purpose. What are the benefits? Well, this is where you tie it into your industry. So if you work in the financial sector and APT 7 is known to target banks or investment firms, this is probably where you need to live. You need to live in the APTs and get into their mindset, the ones who specifically target your organization. And from there, you can kind of work off the MITRE attack matrix, as buzzwordy as it is, but people like it because the format. You can select TTPs from there, and you like, I just want to test my SIEM's capability to correlate this data based off EDR solution sending alerts up to it. Okay, well, we can utilize this exact TTP to conduct that action. And then we can test that specific function. And then, like I said before, it puts their true risk into perspective. Really, if you have an APT that's known to target this organization, you're going to emulate them because that's what's important to your boss or your CISO or your CEO. They want to know who's targeting them. If they don't already know that, they're probably not well informed, but that's your job, really. You're there to convey that severity. We can utilize threat actor intel to find this information. If you don't have a threat cell or a threat intelligence function within your organization, sometimes it's on you, the pen tester, to find that stuff, or you, the red teamer, because you don't have someone to bounce that off of. I know a lot of teams, they'll embed or employ a specific person for threat intel research, but not every organization is that fortunate. We can use MITRE, we can use various threat feeds. There's hundreds. They're really cool to put on your SOC wall when you have people come in, when you have leadership come through and look at all your fancy graphs and stuff. Security vendors, those are probably my favorite go-tos. While they are trying to, of course, sell you their product, they also produce a lot of amazing research on various APTs or various pieces of malware and techniques, etc. I threw up a couple of FireEye, CrowdStrike. Spectre Ops, I know they do a lot of training, and the guys who work in the company also develop Bloodhound. They put out some amazing training if you've never been. So it's a little expensive, but it's pretty good. So the imaginary adversary, this is like the real fun for Red Team because you come up with the adversary, right? You come up with the APT. You build out your entire infrastructure however you see fit. It could be to replicate infrastructure of APT1, and you want to use the lateral movement techniques of 28. Like, it's whatever you want. And this is really where real red teams live, especially the ones who operate on a weekly basis. I don't know how some of those teams churn out so many engagements in a week, but this is where the real red teamers live, at least from my perspective. And the correlating the adversary TTPs to testing actions. So from a pen test perspective or a red team perspective, this should be thrown into your debrief or your reporting cycle. And this should kind of like a continuous feedback loop, should feed back into your lessons learned. Kind of like if you're familiar with DevOps methodology, like it goes into your backlog and then basically it just pushes back into your next operation of like, oh, we should do this better next time because we failed at this point, but now we know how to fix that. So what does a typical engagement look like? So from my perspective and my experience, we'll select the type of engagement, right? We'll pick, are we going to create an adversary or are we emulating a specific threat? From there, we'll commence our plan of action. So the plan, develop, execute, debrief. Like I said, that's probably the longest process you'll ever do, and you'll probably pull your hair out at the end of it, but it'll be fun. Develop TTPs or use open source methods. This goes back to utilizing known adversary TTPs or just creating your own and having fun with it, which is fun as long as there's not too much risk involved, and as long as you don't destroy the network. So, and then of course you execute your plan of action, and hopefully it's hopefully it's a good engagement based on the planning you completed. And if it isn't, that's where the lessons learned feed back into your next engagement. But of course, the key portion to all this, like as much as the pen testing actions and the red team actions are fun, we want to make sure all parties are involved, or at least from the beginning, and debrief everyone. So we all know where to go next time. And we can all learn lessons from that entire engagement. Okay, so I kind of talked about this a little already, but a quick example of, so what we did, I got to formulate this one real quick. All right, so what we did is we took a specific threat, right? We chose, I think it was APT 28, that one's a hot topic right now. We chose that one. So what we did is we implemented the exact same TTPs. We had our forensic shop or our RE shop reverse malware. We utilized it on the network. And so this was like right when my team started. So they weren't really used to this type of activity on the network, besides from the big red team up to the top Air Force level. And they started freaking out, of course, right? And and they thought it was just some rogue admin. I was like, okay, cool. So finish your investigation. They took about 2 weeks to finish the investigation, just turnover reasons. And it came back. They finally figured out it was us. And the issue was we utilized just living off the land techniques and some pre-built binaries that we dropped on the network. And they weren't able to detect this at all. Like, sure, they got a quick alert, but it's like, oh, potential malicious C2 traffic, right? I mean, most of us who have worked at the tier 1 analyst role have seen that alert probably 1,000 times. And we're just like, okay, you know, like I'll check the IP addresses. No, they're good. We're good. Let's move on. And so we're able to correlate the actions of APT 28 with the stuff we did on the network to show deficiencies in our defensive posture. And from there, we're actually able to drive positive change within our own organization. And that kind of really struck a chord with me because, like, that's our purpose, really. And I know I've said that before, but that's the purpose of Red Team, is to make blue better. And you probably heard this 1,000 times, but it's the truth. But why do we have to keep repeating it? Because history repeats itself. They don't listen to us, right? They don't listen to the red team. They don't listen to the blue team. But it's our job to keep pushing that button and going through with it. So I was going to give a demo, but I don't want to burn up Phil's Wi-Fi hotspot. So I kind of took some screenshots, and I'll show you a little graph. So this is something that we use kind of internally to, like, kind of mind map, if you will, if you're familiar with that concept. So we'll go through like kind of an 8-step process. We'll do an adversary selection. We'll determine based on the planning process, is it going to be a TTP, like an exact TTP we're utilizing, or are we correlating some type of objective with the organization, I guess you could say. I'm trying to translate nomenclature from the military side to over here. But so we'll determine the scope, full or specific TTP. And this is kind of goes back to the selected adversary or imaginary. So is the imaginary adversary coming full force at us, or are we selecting a specific TTP and utilizing that on the network? We'll research, we'll ID the tool set. Do we need to develop the tool set? Are we gonna pull this stuff from online? Obviously, like, I will caution, like, I'm all for open source projects, but be conscious of what you're putting on your network, because there have been cases I've seen where we've pulled repos and they've been compromised. And that's, fortunately, we have some amazing defense systems, so we caught it immediately, but they weren't happy about that. So rehearse and train. So if you don't have somewhat of a simulated, like, testing environment that simulates your enterprise, this is key. Whether you're gonna build this on your own home lab, and obviously don't name it work home lab, you know what I mean? But this is your place to rehearse and train your team. And during the planning process, like, I know it sounds like enormous, like a pain in the butt kind of thing, but this is your time. This is your time to really nail down your TTPs, the exact actions you're going to be taking on the network. You need to know this plan inside and out. And, like, that's where, like, kind of my military background, and, like, you'll hear it probably from, like, big known veteran speakers, but, like, having your plan, your training for the fight. And I know I hate to bring that kind of, like, to this type of environment. You need to train for the fight, because whether you believe it or not, someone is targeting your organization. And so you need to be able to emulate that threat. So you begin your engagement, and then we can insert TTPs at random points based on step 2. This is just depending on if it's not a full scope engagement or not. This is kind of a quick little chart or a flow of how the organization or the operation would go. As you can see, like, this portion right here is, like, obviously our continuous feedback loop, right? So if we get on our initial target, we do further recon. This is your run-of-the-mill pen testing process. but with obviously throwing in specific TTPs. All right, so that's, whew, holy cow. Was this change anything? Did that change it? No, okay, never mind, of course not. All right, so I kind of want to talk a little bit about the planning and management portion of the team. So like I've said before, we utilize DevOps methodology in and out, and it's like done wonders for our team. So if you aren't familiar with GitLab, just a quick rundown. Like, so GitLab is just like GitHub. You can store your repos and text documents, right? Or whatever you want to put on there. So just an example. So like we have just our generic scripts, and then on the side, we'll move over to our issues tab. This is the fun part, at least for me, because I get to track what everybody's doing. So we could you could manage your entire team via this method, and it's great. So like during an operation, if the team lead's like, hey, you completed this operation, let me verify your actions are complete. So we'll get into the blues side of things and track down our actions. And then hopefully that can help us train them to find us as well. Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the Scrum methodology, I suggest you look into it because it's improved the efficiency of my team like tenfold, and I love it. Okay. So here's an example, kind of a flow chart and an example execution of an operation, obviously on a small scale. So down at the bottom, we have kind of your starting point. We'll move to the next target, how we're going to move there, et cetera. And then this is just obviously a generic view, but the cool thing about this is you can break it out even more. And you could say like, at this time, I'm going to do this action. At this time, I'm going to do this action, and so on. And then it just helps, you're basically building the report as you go, as you should when you're pen testing, is you're building the report as you go. So it's not after the 2-week engagement, you're like, oh crap, I got to put a report together. Okay, so keys to success when it comes to red teaming and just getting to that mindset in general is obviously planning. I'm not gonna repeat it 4 times, but that's key. Like if you don't have a solid plan, you're screwed. Documentation is key. This allows you to avoid mistakes later on down the line. And I don't know if you've done a pen test where you've probably got onto somebody's box you shouldn't be on. Fortunately, it wasn't a big deal, but it was documented. So we know who did it. We know how to not do that from now on, what exploits not to use, etc. Communication is key. Like that's probably been driven in your head so many times with different corporate meetings and HR meetings, but if you can't effectively communicate with your team and the parties involved, you're doing yourself a disservice, really. So that's probably one of the key points that I can make. Communicate and work with all parties involved. As I mentioned earlier, the debrief process and planning process should be everyone. Like, so let's say you have a trusted agent, that person needs to be informed at all times because they're probably providing your seeded access. Because let's be honest, even as a red team planning for like 3 months, you don't have the liberty to spend 6 to 8 months to get access to a network, right? So that's where trusted agents come in hand. And keep your team informed, like I mentioned. Please, communication is key. So I didn't want to leave out the blue teamers. I was thinking about that on the way here. So how can you as a blue teamer do something in your environment or your lab to help you replicate some of these TTPs and build defenses, playbooks, actually TTPs on how a defensive operator can help? So if you've heard of Caldera, it's basically an automated way to create these actions based on the MITRE attack matrix. There's also Atomic, which is great. Use the MITRE attack matrix. I hate to push that like it's like AI and cloud basically. No, I mean MITRE's good because it translates well to leadership. It's a picture they can understand, and you don't have to go super detailed. But as a defender, you can drill down into it. It's probably commands you use all the time, honestly. It's probably stuff you're doing on a daily basis. So if you've ever done like system admin work, and then you move on to the red team side, you're like, wait, I was just doing this the other day when I was patching a computer. Like I was creating accounts and stuff, but it's actually like that's living off the land right there. Red Hunt OS, if you've heard of it, it's amazing. Like think of Security Onion, I believe, is the Linux one that has logging and such. Think of this as like kind of the counterpart. This allows you to do threat emulation and threat hunting all in one VM. It's great. Like if you can find a spot in your home lab for that, I would. And practice. This goes for both pen testers, red teamers, and blue teamers. It's a team effort, really, and we're there to make the organization better. Cool. That's all I have. So thank you. Yeah, any questions about pen testing, red teaming, building a red team? Sorry. Yes. So depending on the time frame we have for an engagement, sorry, really bright. I'm trying to get that slide. Whatever, I'll talk about it. So yeah, right. So as a normal red team, you probably have redundant infrastructure already set up. Like we'll sometimes deploy like containers, like serverless architecture for our C2 infrastructure. But yeah, so that's a key part, right? So unless you're doing some type of seeded access, like where you already have access on a box, that needs to be in your planning cycle. Like if you don't spend the time finding that out, you're kind of screwed, right? You kind of screw yourself over. Yeah, that's where you keep all parties involved. Like we have not only do we have someone on like kind of the defensive side work with us, like the blue side, really, the SOC analyst or the threat hunters, we'll have just a network admin really, and they'll be our seated access. But yeah, everything, if you miss something in the planning phase, yeah, that should be like one of your hot priorities. How are you getting in? Or what are you going to do after you get in, really? Cool. Thanks for the question. Yes, sir. This one? Okay. Yeah. So it depending on so like from like a pen test perspective or a red teaming perspective, is that what you're thinking, or just in general? Yeah, of course. So depending on, I would say, your budget or your team's capabilities, you could build something out that automates this entire process. And so without saying too much, we do something similar to this depending on the time frame we have for an engagement, and we'll push that data into automating playbook development as well. So yeah, so you can definitely automate this process. Cool. Anybody else? Red teaming, pen testing, blue team stuff. Cool. Thank y'all very much. Thanks. Thanks.